Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic was released in July 2003, around 14 years ago. It feels like not many games released during the summer month, and especially July, but there are some exceptions like Warcraft 3, Reign of Chaos, Final Fantasy 9 and 10, the mentioned Knights of the Old Republic and more. 14 years ago, things were quite different. LucasArts still existed, Lucasfilm's new Star Wars trilogy wasn't finished yet, Westwood Studios was freshly closed, we got Command & Conquer Generals 5 months ago, and Warcraft 3 The Frozen Throne was also just released, so the RTS genre was still doing good. Not to forget, the good old Star Wars Galaxies and Empire Divided got released around the same time. What a summer! I especially remember Frozen Throne and the Gothic 2 add-on Night of the Raven. The other stuff wasn't out in Europe yet. Also at this time, Bioware wasn't acquired by Electronic Arts yet, and after giving us amazing CRPGs like Baldur's Gate 1, Neverwinter Nights and Baldur's Gate 2, we were pretty hyped for Knights of the Old Republic. And rightfully so, it's a great game and very talented people worked on it. One of its designers was James Ohlen, who to this day still works for Bioware and has worked even on the Baldur's Gate games back in the day. His last project was Mass Effect Andromeda, even though he was, I guess, more of a supervisor for it. Another prominent name was David Gaider, who also played a big part in developing and especially writing parts of Knights of the Old Republic. He, for example, invented the character HK-47. He worked on many other Bioware games too, but left the company after 17 years in 2016 and joined Beamdog, a company founded by other Bioware veterans, like one of Bioware's co-founders, Trent Oster. They make and release enhanced editions of old Bioware and Black Isle Studios games. But he wasn't the only writer. Bioware had pretty much always big writing teams. Another big name is definitely Drew Karpyshyn. He was, I assume, the main writer for Knights of the Old Republic. He also worked on a lot of other Bioware games like Mass Effect 1 and 2, Neverwinter Nights, and is working on Anthem right now. So he still is working for Bioware, even though he left the company for several years to focus on writing his novels. The director of Knights of the Old Republic back in the day was Casey Hudson, who was also involved in developing and later directing a lot of other Bioware games, from Baldur's Gate 2 to Mass Effect 3. And like many, he left Bioware 2014 and now works for Microsoft Studios. So a lot of people left Bioware over the years, but also some returned or are still working there to this day. Obviously 2003 is 14 years ago, quite a long time. Bioware was a different company back then, even though Knights of the Old Republic was the start of a development that started the Mass Effect series. When I played Knights of the Old Republic a bit as preparation for this video, I feared it would feel very clunky and outdated. Hadn't touched it for a decade, but to my surprise, it was not. I think it aged quite well. Of course, the graphics are outdated and some parts feel a bit odd by today's standards, like moving your characters. It feels a bit clunky at times, especially turning. But beside this, I could hardly stop playing it. Still, a few things have changed over the years, and I'm not sure if the consensus of the industry for AAA game development and how you design big modern RPGs is the best way always. There is a trend of making open world games, with some exceptions like Uncharted or the upcoming God of War game, and we see a mechanical roleplayification in many big titles. So, Knights of the Old Republic is not an open world game, it's multi-linear. There is a term tube levels, at least in my country, for a very linear level design where you just can go one path. A good example for this would be large parts of Final Fantasy XIII's level design when it comes to RPGs, but many story-driven first-person shooters use this too, like Call of Duty. The next more open thing would be the mentioned multilinear level design, or non-linear level design. There is a joke term open tube for it here too. So basically a tube with more exits that lead to more tubes and could be interconnected with each other, sometimes disguised as open world-like levels. Dark Souls 1 does this extremely well, and Knights of the Old Republic is an example too. I like this approach a lot, and it is to this day for CRPGs very common, but you rarely meet it in the spheres of AAA titles these days. And then we have open world, often combined with the term sandbox, where you have giant areas and in theory you can go everywhere. Horizon Zero Dawn, Zelda Breath of the Wild and GTA 5 are good examples here. I would say GTA 3, which came out 2001, set a standard for the open world sandbox term, and over the years it got very popular. A lot of AAAs use this design approach because it can be very expensive to make, so smaller studios often don't design games like this, but there are some exceptions. There are also different approaches here, like mentioned one giant open world level without loading times or several separated giant areas. The sandbox term is also not well defined, but I understand it as being able to change and play with mechanics of the world relatively freely, because the world is more simulation based, like in GTA except for the missions. EVE Online or Minecraft would be the best or purest example for sandbox I can think of. An open world game that is different in that regard would be Gothic or Risen. Still, almost all those games often use linear levels too, like for quests and missions. Sometimes the lines between multi-linear and open world level design can be a bit blurry too. Borderlands is an interesting example in this context. But even though Knights of the Old Republic is not an open world game, it is in many areas non-linear and often creates the illusion of you can walk everywhere you want quite well. That also means they filled those levels with a lot of characters and content you can interact with in almost any order, and a lot of it is also optional, which creates a good illusion of freedom for the player. Of course, this game did not invent this. Classic CRPGs, even from Bioware, were for a long time like this, but I would say Knights of the Old Republic did again a great job at this classic design approach. It does several things right. First, it uses a strong license and shows a timeline where the developers have a lot of freedom but can easily implement iconic elements of the source material, not using iconic characters and building their own new characters themselves, but make the game still feel very much like Star Wars, which is a big accomplishment. I don't want to go too deep into this, but I think they chose a very interesting time that probably does not mess up too much with the source material. Of course, in Star Wars that is also far more easy compared to other universes like Lord of the Rings. Second, they tease the player. When we arrive at Terrace, we learn more about the Sith Lord Malak, the Jedi Bastila, her importance, and the lower levels of Terrace right at the beginning. We also learn about the Sith fleet blockade, the Sith troops searching for us, and the consequences this has for Terrace and its citizens. We have this distant goal, where to go, what to do, and what awaits us quite early in the game. The exposition lets us know what we need to know and hooks us to the world and story, because we have the same problem as many people on Terrace and can relate to their situation. Third, quests are connected to the teased story's context. With this basic story knowledge we get at the beginning of a section, the game's quest design evolves around progressing through those goals or not. There are a lot of optional missions, and you first have to find them by exploring, sometimes offering small different paths to do so. Then you can decide what quest you want to do or not, and the quests themselves often offer several different ways to solve them too. Mostly one light side and one dark side option, but sometimes more. What felt great about it is that most of those quests are carefully placed. You stumble into them and they are thematically or context-wise to some degree connected to your knowledge and main quest. So, for example on Terrace, some of them do not feel like a waste of time doing annoying busy work for some NPC you just have met, but more like exploring the world further and investigating into the right direction, even though it is often stupid busy work just for an NPC. The game elegantly hides this and encourages exploring. I would say story, world building and quest design go hand in hand and create a believable world and story that feels alive and like Star Wars, even though everything is far smaller and less polished compared to the big open world RPGs we get today. It's maybe personal taste, but I would say this approach in combination with designing actual levels instead of giant open areas makes content far more condensed, so that all the things you do feel far more important to the overall story and your progression. Of course, this approach has also downsides. Sometimes you can't go through a door or go over a small obstacle, breaking the illusion, because the openness is indeed just an illusion. I call it the "I'm fighting against gods but it's impossible to climb over this pile of junk" effect. In open world games you encounter this not that often, but therefore the developers have to pack these giant areas full with things to do, which leads to far less condensed quests that sometimes feel off and break the illusion too. The "I'm fighting against gods but I got this quest where I need to pick those flowers for this guy I just met who has nothing to do with my actual goals" effect. Doing this right in both design approaches is, by the way, extremely difficult. Not many games find the perfect balance, and when they do, they are considered one of the best of their kind. With all that said, story, world and quest design is still very good in Knights of the Old Republic. What about combat? Before I started playing it again, I thought this would be the least well-aged part of the game, but it wasn't that bad. The game is heavily inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. As someone who really likes all sorts of tabletop RPGs, that is not bad for me, but I noticed a few things. The combat is round-based, which is very rare for AAA RPGs today. I would say most bigger RPGs use a more action-oriented, real-time combat approach these days. Knowing this, I smiled a bit when an attack missed, because there is a chance to miss attacks in the game. Not a big deal, and if you play some modern retro-style RPGs, it's in them too. But knowing that this was a AAA game back in the day, it was something I haven't seen in a AAA game for a long time. Most games these days focus on DPS values and only allow to miss by using certain abilities like blinding an enemy or by just missing the attack because it was not aimed correctly, which makes sense in real-time action-oriented combat systems. Just imagine you hit an enemy in Dark Souls and your attack connects, but it deals no damage because of a random number generator in the background. It would not feel right. For round-based combat systems, missing an attack makes a lot more sense, but those systems aren't that popular anymore in comparison to the number of real-time combat systems we find in AAA games. Of course, classic RPGs and alike are having a renaissance again, but they don't or rarely sell on AAA levels. The combat in KotOR has a few problems too. Some builds are incredibly strong, some are incredibly weak. When you have your Jedi abilities, you can win most fights by just spamming the same ability over and over. So I would say there are a few balance issues. Still, I would not recommend to look up builds if you play it for the first time. And just keep in mind that this is a combat-focused game, so pumping everything in wisdom and charisma make things a bit more difficult. Also, combat can be repetitive. Even though the combat is not perfect, it does many things right. It has definitely some options, for example stealth, mines, grenades and special attacks, which often have some bonuses and penalties, like more damage and a penalty on hit chance. You can switch between your party members and even change them, so you have some more options and access to different classes. I wouldn't call it very deep, but it's still okay for a 14 years old game. I would say the developers have found a very good balance between combat, story and dialogue. You have enough other content in the game that does not include combat. Sometimes you can even avoid fighting. In addition, you also get some mini-games like the swoop racing. It's for sure not good enough to be a standalone game, but it's good for a change. And this is really a good summary. The game knows what it's good at and focuses on it. The content is condensed and they manage to create believable level chapters that feel alive, encouraging the player to explore. It also feels very much like Star Wars. The quests often feel meaningful and are helping you to find out more about your main goals, while giving you options to solve them. The combat is solid and not the highest priority of the game, which makes the mix of content feel balanced. I personally like the story, but some could find it a bit cliché. Some would argue that back in the day Bioware was maybe around their peak. However, it was definitely a different company than we have today. A lot has changed, and so has the approach of designing games, especially in the spheres of AAA titles. I'm a bit sad that we don't get AAA games like Knights of the Old Republic anymore, or rarely, but good news, they are still made just by smaller companies. Thank you for watching. As always, at the end of my videos, some small information. This time I experimented a bit. Old game, a bit tied to current developments in the industry. I also try to change the style of the video a bit editing wise, but what can I say, I talk too much. I hope you liked it. If so, consider checking out my other content. Thank you again for watching, and goodbye.